So, Peter, I have heard you mention Kierkegaard in some of your work, but the reason Kierkegaard is important for me is, in fact, out of love, not love for Kierkegaard, but love for my best mate. So he is a massive Kierkegaardian, and him and I, we've been going at this quite a bit, where I even shared some of your talks with him, and he essentially says that his problem is that, uh, and when he says you, he means he's referring to you here because I sent one of your talks, that you conflate reality with God. And then in kind of typical Kierkegaardian way, he's saying for him, God is something beyond reality, something that's unspoken of. And then, of course, Kierkegaard being a very kind of pious Christian, and he's a theologian after all, this is very clear that he believes in this absolute God, and he even says that in the eyes of God, we are always in the wrong. So just what are your intimations when you hear the name Kierkegaard and that kind of thinking, where there still is a beyond our reality, so to speak?
Yes, well, I have a huge amount of respect for Kierkegaard. It's very hard not to. Incredible thinker.
For sure.
So, and one of the things that I get out of his work, as not someone who's a very close reader of him, I sometimes think of him as my favorite least read philosopher, as a philosopher who my love of him and the amount that I've read is not weirdly not connected, but what I've got from my reading of him, particularly like for like a book like Fear and Trembling, is that faith is a kind of like embrace of contradiction. It's a living within this, and that's what I love about him. But you've hit the nail on the head with exactly where my critique of him is that he embraces this idea of faith as a type of. I mean, this would be one of my critiques of someone like Jordan Peterson and his reading of the Bible. If you ever look at Peterson's reading of the biblical text is about providing wisdom. It's about providing moral understanding. Now, there's something interesting about this with Peterson, because Peterson has this kind of real love of the depth of religion, and his fear is that a kind of a type of one-dimensional secularism disconnects us from this deep well of stories and traditions that can help us touch deep parts of ourselves and others, right? So there's a very Jungian reading of the biblical text. So whenever he does a close reading of Exodus or Genesis, you'll hear every verse almost is a kind of aphorism of wisdom as to how we should act. But that's exact opposite with Kierkegaard, right? The Bible is exactly like the thing that destroys our wisdom and our ethics, right? So for Kierkegaard, he says, like, you can say anything you want about Jesus and I'll be fine, but don't ever call him a wise man or an
He's not a
ethical
wise
man.
guy. Yeah.
It's like, the whole Bible starts, or is the person of faith, the man of faith, is a guy who goes up to a mountaintop to kill his kid because he heard a voice from God.
Abraham. Yeah. Abraham. He's a lunatic. Yeah. Yeah.
Lunatic, man. Like, and like Kierkegaard enjoys, like he literally enjoys painting a kind of Peterson figure, to be honest, like in a church, trying to make that into a wisdom, into an ethics, right? And all of the funny maneuvers you have to make to kind of like the like a choreography you have to do to make that a wise thing, Kierkegaard wants to go, no, this is madness, and there's something the trauma, there's something traumatic about the biblical text. There's something fundamentally ruptures our notions of wisdom and knowledge, and that's the Kierkegaard I love, right? But at the end of the day, yes, your friend is right that and this is where the young Bart is very Kierkegaardian, is that God is like an absolute no, which is wonderful, an absolute no to our yes. So every time we build a political or ethical kingdom, like God, the name God is the name for a wrecking ball, right? And I love that. I love that notion. However, this is where I think Kierkegaard just doesn't push far enough. Is that it's a Kantian, ultimately a Kantian notion. Now, with your friend, that's a really interesting critique. It says, like, I conflate God with reality. To say something about that is, I would want to argue that, let's say, theology is interesting. It's a practice and it's a theory. So there's usually a community connected to it, but also theology is interested in that which is otherwise than being, otherwise than reality. I would say, like, if you're going to boil it down into a nutshell, theology looks at and is interested in what is not explicable in purely materialistic terms. Now, there's a whole pile of ways of understanding what is otherwise than being. You know, we sometimes call it mind, right? It's traditional soul, which is usually mind. That means mind in philosophy is so that non-material dimension of us, right? Also, object A, das Ding, is otherwise than being. So there's and so I would want to say to your friend, I think he's kind of right. Like, he's picking up something correct in a way, but I don't want to conflate reality with let's say the signifier God. I want to be theological in the sense of, I think there is a reality that is otherwise than being, and that reality in a sense is more real than what's around us. And yet it's just like that movie and that book creates the third, right? That Q text, which is more real than what's real, right? It's and it is created by the failure of the movie and the failure of the book. So it's formed by that, and yet it is the cause of the failure of the movie and the book, right? So just as some as a traditional theologian might say, Jesus was born in time and yet is eternal, I want to say there is an otherwise in being which is eternal, that comes into being through material reality. So I don't want to conflate this notion of otherwise than being. I don't want to conflate that with reality. I want to say that anyone worth their salt in this frame is trying to articulate what Lacan calls the real, capital R real, the real being ironically what is not real, but the real being this otherwise than being. And my issue with Kierkegaard is that otherwise than being is substantive. It is a Kantian substantive, and ultimately it means that we can it almost is like what Hegel would call what did he call it, the sinner, the unhappy sinner, I think he calls it, whereas basically we can never we're always separated from ultimate reality. I mean, the whole thing about Hegel is Hegel says, well, whenever you realize that ultimate reality is separated from itself, that alienation is overcome. So for Kierkegaard, I think alienation remains an issue. It's too substantive. And yeah, and I want to. That's why I think Hegel is a better figure.
And would you say, Peter, it took me a while to get where you're getting at. I think I'm starting to make sense of this. So would you say that the Kierkegaardian quote unquote real is again something that's there, it's a substance, it's God, whatever you may call it, something that's complete. Whereas as Zizek puts it, the Lacanian real, it's when there's a failure in the symbolic order. And for you, the otherwise of being comes to being, so to speak, from the failure of our being. Is that correct?
That's correct. Now, I will say this because I'm always nervous about this, because like in terms of what I'm trying to do, I generally I'm very open to anyone who tries to maintain this otherwise than being in whichever way they do it. But yes, ultimately, when you push to where I am philosophically speaking, my theoretical frame, the theoretical frame that I feel, rightly or wrongly, is more robust, is the idea that God is the signifier of the failure itself. So yeah, and so there is kind of a rupture. And for me, so God is not the signifier of that substance which is beyond our understanding, so much as God is the signifier for something that is unknown, but it's a known unknown. It's a type of radical asymmetry within reality itself, generated by a failure. Yes.
Yes, and also the fact that you kind of brought up the Jungian unconscious, because kind of the caricatured Freudian unconscious is it's this deep, profound thing, like the iceberg metaphor, right? It's this deep thing that's there that you can, and all our real self is there. And Zizek says, if you truly look into yourself, what you find is you're full of shit, because the unconscious really comes in the contradictions. It's not something within you.
Yes, and it's very hard to grasp. I mean, this is why I think the Jungian unconscious, and even I think in Melanie Klein, but
Melanie Klein,
is so appealing to people. Yeah, is that it becomes this a receptacle that has lots of content, or for, it's a substantive thing. And for Jung, it's like a yin and yang, where there's consciousness, there's unconsciousness. And for him, in his papers on the unconscious, you get, he very is clear about this, that the unconscious almost brings out the opposite. So if you are look at someone too poorly in your unconscious, they might look like a king, right? So the unconscious is almost trying to rectify, like if there's too much chaos, it brings calm, and vice versa. So it's this balance. But the Freudian unconscious, especially as it develops into Lacan, is not a substantive other. It is the name for the rupture self, and that's hard to grasp, because and I find it hard to grasp because, whenever this is the Freudian parapraxis, slips of the tongue. Why is a psychoanalyst always interested in not what you say, but in what you feel to say, and some failure? You mention someone's name by accident, you've mistakenly say something. So there's something being said, and then it's very easy to think that's substantive, right? That something's speaking that shows that you have a substantive hatred for your father, when you really think you love them, you really dislike them. But a better analogy for the unconscious is, it's like the quantum dimension in physics, which is not constituted until it kind of is observed, until it's measured. The measurement constitutes it. So it's almost like that our consciousness is disrupted in various ways, and as we put language to that disruption, it becomes substantive at a conscious level, but it wasn't constituted substantively before you put language to it. That's a hard thing to get your head around, but I think it's ultimately a much better notion than some, as you say, the iceberg, which is you have substantive unconscious things. That's just called the pre-conscious. That's not unconscious.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, I haven't read much of Jung's papers, but in his autobiography, he conflates God with the unconscious. He just says God is the unconscious, and in a rather funny way. And at the time when he was writing this, a lot of conservative, let's say Christian theologians, were kind of being dismissive of psychoanalysis, because they thought, oh, these people are reducing God to just some psychological phenomena. But that was because they were viewing psychoanalysis through this lens of union, substantial unconscious. And sorry, Peter, I know I'm cognizant of time, but just one more thing. Zizek also points out that, currently we're going through this kind of AI revolution in our culture, at least ostensibly. And that one thing that LLMs, so large language models, like all these ChatGPT and whatnot, what they probably don't have is where, and I'm becoming, this is very speculative here, but is that the problem with LLMs is they can't, in their language, it's everything that an LLM is what they substantially say, what the agent declares. It doesn't account for the negative, the negation, the contradiction. And I don't know if you could put that into an LLM the way we as human subjects have it.
Yes, no, that's very true. And Zizek's written on that very well, and Hegel and the Wired Brain. But it's like, for example, if there was, I can't remember the philosopher who said that the wine that tastes best is the wine that someone else paid for, right? And I kind of like that. It's like so if you have two identical bottles of wine, the wine that you say stole, you didn't pay for it, you stole it, is going to taste better. There's a series I love called Peep Show, and this guy steals a bar of chocolate and he's going, oh, it tastes great. And his friend says the secret ingredient is crime, right? That's kind of the idea, is that what makes it taste better. But a computer wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two bottles of wine, right? Because the two bottles of wine are identical, but one is different because it was stolen. And so Zizek uses that famous joke, and he uses that guy goes into a coffee shop, says, could I have coffee without cream? The woman says, sorry, I don't have any cream. We only have milk. Can it be coffee without milk? And, Zizek makes the point that a machine will not be able to tell the difference between a black coffee without cream, and a black coffee without milk. Right. So that they will all be identical. The unconscious, in a sense, is there's a dimension of being human, which can tell the difference of that. So there's me, and there's me who isn't with that woman that I wish I'd been with. you know. It's like there's she's not there, she's not present, and so in one sense I'd be identical with or without that person, but that without is actually deeply important to understand me, right? You know, if you can't understand this, and so there's lots of very interesting things you can say about that. But if people are interested, I think Hegel and the Wired Brain is a good book on that. Yeah.
Yeah, and for us Zizekians, being the chauvinists we are, there's always got to be a woman involved somewhere.
Yes, exactly. I know.
Some sexual thing with a woman.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
I know.